prayer.
Okay.
Maybe you can do no birth, no death. No birth, no death. After the prayer. Let's begin with a prayer.
Heavenly Father,
Heavenly Father,
Divine Mother,
Divine Mother,
Friend beloved God,
Friend beloved God,
Great Masters,
Great Masters,
Jesus Christ,
Jesus Christ,
Babaji Krishna,
Babaji Krishna,
Lahiri Mahashai,
Lahiri Mahashai,
Swami Sri Yukteswar,
Swami Sri Yukteswar,
Paramahansa Yogananda,
Paramahansa Yogananda,
Saints of East and West,
Saints of East and West,
Saints of past and present,
Saints of past and present,
Saints of future,
Saints of future,
come to us now
come to us now
in the form of wisdom.
in the form of wisdom.
Come to us now
Come to us now
that we become enlightened.
that we become enlightened.
Come to us now
Come to us now
that we be free.
that we be free.
Om,
Om,
peace.
peace.
Amen.
Amen.
No birth, no death, no cast have I.
No birth, no death, no cast
have I. Father, Mother, have I none. Father, Mother, have I none. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. Mind nor intellect, nor ego feeling. Mind nor intellect, nor ego feeling. Sky nor earth, nor metals am I. Sky nor earth, nor metals am I. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. Beyond all dreams, bornness am I. Beyond all dreams, bornness am I. Free from dreams of all earthly life. Free from dreams of all earthly life. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. Beyond all time, I beyond all fear, free, Lord, free in thy bliss. Free, oh free, Lord, free in thy bliss. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. I am He, Blessed Spirit, I am He. Let's have a moment of silence. As we go into descending Dwapara Yuga, the time of the pyramids, the time of prehistory according to our worldview, descending into Kali Yuga, the history that we are more familiar with, the descent from Satya and Treta into an age familiar in a reverse kind of way to where we are now today. Om Shanti Shanti. Amen.
Okay, what is it? Somebody's phone?
That was
Eine kleine Nachtmusik.
Treta Yuga calling.
Reminds me of being in the little cafe in Salzburg.
So, descending Dwapara and our final 6 chapters. I think we're on slide 82.
Zippity-doo-dah.
I think that's right. 83. Oh my Lord, I didn't write that. Very good, okay. Descending Dwapara Yuga, chapter 16 is about the Great Pyramid. This has been a great adventure, and these last chapters are more familiar to us and have therefore more of the head-tilting possibility, worldview-changing possibility.
Can you all see over on this side? Yeah, okay.
But I think of all things that can trigger this worldview represented by the Yugas, there is one thing, the Great Pyramid, that stands head and above them all. It is the one thing anomalous in all history, as we know it, one of the great wonders of the so-called ancient world that stands mutably in testimony that conflicts with our present scientific worldview. The Great Pyramid, now in this, you can't really see this well, but in your book you can see it. Has anybody here ever been there? I have not. Jerry, you've been there. Yeah, someday I'd like to go when, things are settled down. But these giant stones are sort of stepped like this, like you might see in some of the Mesoamerican pyramids, but in truth, it had all been originally faced with limestone in such a way that in the desert sun it would have gleamed for miles and miles like an incredible object. It is obviously the oldest building on Earth. It's the heaviest building on Earth. It has, I don't know how many books have been read about it. If you were to Google the Great Pyramid, you'd get more hits than you'd care to follow up on. And of course, a modern theory posits that around about the end of what we would call Treta Yuga. Go back to that first slide. I want to identify the dates. I find it helpful. So what we're talking about here, Treta Yuga ended its descending Sandhis, 300 Sandhi period, at 3100 BC. And thence began a 200-year Sandhi period of transition, 2 centuries, into Dwapara Yuga, proper of which began, according to this theory, in 2900 BC, running 2,000 years to 900 BC, before commencing a 200-year period, Sandhi, transitioning away from that consciousness on the verge of the dark era of the Kali. Okay, so according to so-called modern theory, this was the Great Pyramid must have appeared remarkably at the coagulation of Stone Age tribes bumping about the desert regions of Egypt and got together to plan the world's greatest building. It seems quite plausible. They just love dragging stones 500 miles, 50-ton stones. It just seems so obvious that a lot of hemp ropes and trees. Of course, there were a lot of trees there in Egypt, So quite plausible. In its sophistication, in terms of, it's been the most measured building on Earth. I mean, it's been measured and remeasured time and time again, and the degree of accuracy and the inlay of the stones just has been commented by since the 17th, 18th century. 2.3 million blocks, large blocks, some of which weigh 50 tons. That's 100,000 pounds coming from as far away as 500 miles. It's not especially tall, although it is half the height of the Empire State Building. It comprises 13 acres. And as I said earlier, it's the world's heaviest building, and it's been in existence for 5,000 years. Okay? It is level in its measurements in this 13-acre base, only off by 7/8 of an inch across its entire base, probably due to the fact that the tectonic plates underneath it shifted, probably as a result of its weight. That's my speculation. But in any case, it was entitled to move a little bit one direction or another. It's within 1/20th of an arc of perfect alignment to the cardinal points of the compass. Its circumference in relation to the height is exactly pi, 22/7. It's, this is something I'm just frankly have no idea what this, the so-called golden ratio of phi, I'm sure some of you math whizzes know, I've never heard of it, is also can be calculated. And in the ancient world's measurement of cubits, it's divisible into the Earth's circumference. Okay, so let's, this it won't project very well for you, but it is in the book. It was the best thing I could find. This is an interior drawing. Now, mind you, if it was built at the approximately 3000 BC, we'll come back to that in a minute, it remained impenetrable. It had no doors, it had no windows, it had no obvious openings, and it was impenetrable until 900 AD when one of the Muslim caliphs used dynamite to try to figure out how to get into the thing. Okay, it's open. Okay, so if you were standing at the Nile River, okay, looking towards the Atlantic Ocean, if you can figure that one out, and to your right is north to Europe, and to your left is south to Saudi Arabia or Somalia or somewhere, and so you'd be looking west into the pyramid. It was built on a mound. It was probably built, by examining the stonework, it was apparently built in several stages, and there was probably an observatory of some sort on a mound that was already 100 feet tall. Normally in construction you'd level the mound and begin your construction, but they built somehow the whole thing on this mound. And it has these air ducts, very small. I think the line doesn't go all the way because Biasa or somebody wrote, well, not Biasa, but they wrote the word air ducts there. But each of the chambers, kings and queens chambers, have air shafts. Now, mummification didn't exist for several centuries after this point in the lesser pyramids, smaller and not as sophisticated in their construction. There were never any mummies found. The caliph never found a mummy. The sarcophagus, so-called in the king's chamber, had to have been put in there before they finished it. In fact, to get into the chamber, you have to lower your head and get through it like this. And on top of it are these massive blocks. Now imagine this is all stone, so it's got to be pretty darn heavy. But right above this chamber are these massive, massive stones. There's not as much in the Queen's chamber, and they don't talk about what was in there. And there's also this grand gallery, which has this perfect symmetry. The entrance was from the north, and you can see these passageways. It's all stone, nothing else in it. And there's a subterranean chamber, and they didn't talk about that, and I haven't actually studied it beyond our book, this thing. But the theories are, of course, wide-ranging as to what it is. Seismic resonance with the Earth's pulsations, resonance chamber, and so forth. We'll come to a slide in that in a minute. But it's a remarkable structure with, in all fairness, no known explanation. Just nothing. It's like the Newgrange Padma and I saw in Ireland, and of which there are hundreds of these things around the world. There's no obvious explanation in relation to the enormous amount of energy it took to build these things. No obvious function. Okay. There was a book by some machinist. Again, they didn't really explain who this fellow was, but who did a lot of his measurements and was very impressed by the accuracy of it all. For example, he found that, I think it was the sarcophagus itself, was level within 10,000ths of an inch. And then in other parts of the pyramid, I think on the outside, they've been identified as drill marks, potentially, in any case. As to its age, like everything of this era, there's some variety. They used some carbon tracing with some of the mortar, but it goes to the earliest, to 2560 to about 2900 BC. Okay, nearby is the Great Sphinx. If you can imagine, estimates make it 4,000 years older than the Great Pyramid. It's, there are signs of water erosion, according to our authors, who are quoting somebody else. And as you may know, there's not a lot of water in Egypt, at least not out in the desert. And however, other studies know that there was a time when rainfall was much greater. And that's the main reason I believe they're able to make an estimate of the antiquity of the Great Sphinx. And therefore, or they speculate, I should say, based on all of these facts, that these general areas were probably used for in one form or another as well back into Treta Yuga. Okay, we can go on. Now, the Great Valley of the Kings, the tombs that are famous in Egypt, which are separately located, not right there, didn't actually get constructed for many centuries later, 500, let's see, 25, well, somewhere around 1,000 years later, give or take a few centuries. Mummification, as I said earlier, didn't appear until the Middle Kingdom. That should say, not 16, how do you say that, 1600 BC? Okay. I mentioned the Caliph in the 9th century AD was finally the first person to enter it. And, okay, good. I think I covered all those. For example, with respect to mummification, were that to have been the case, you wouldn't have air shafts because you would want the dry climate. Okay, I think I basically touched on that. We'll hold that for a second. When Padma and I were at New Grange, we had the feeling, and the authors touch on this in various points in the book, but not necessarily all that with crystal clarity. But what occurred to us sitting in that chamber, which was remarkable for the intensity of the silence under all those heavy stones and so forth, and with the antechambers that looked like these little places where you'd put a statue, but you could sit in there, the granite bowls carved out, which, by the way, they also found in the pyramid that are in the Cairo Museum. And you could easily sit cross-legged in these bowls with these sort of niche shape like those things, but the size of a person, surrounded the interior of New Grange. In any case, the sense that these were built at the end of Treta Yuga in a perhaps desperate effort to create a place where one could feel the powerful, subtle vibrations of energy and so forth and consciousness, make a lot of sense. They quote some woman writer, and I know there's quite a few who talk about, the rites of initiation and how the temple grounds were used for that, and they'd send people there to do that. But the idea that these were like resonance chambers, sacred places, shielded from human vibrations of other sorts and so forth, where one could meditate deeply and feel a divine presence, perhaps at least to people like us, and certainly to me, makes more sense than anything else they have come up with. Paul Brunton, whose book, Something to Secret India, and Passage, yeah. It was the book that brought me to India many years ago, driving overland from Europe. It was Paul Brunton's search in secret India that took me there. And his book of the same title in Egypt, he had the chance to spend some time in the king's chamber there and reported quite a profound experience. You probably caught how they recorded Napoleon was shaken and and pale-faced. When he came out of there, he would refuse to say anything about what happened. So, okay. Now, do we stop?
Is it 18?
Yeah.
I mean 17? Yeah, people have questions about the pyramid?
I can't believe nobody's been there.
Jerry's been there. She's somebody.
John?
I don't remember, but does the book talk about the relationship between the pyramid, Greek pyramid, and the Sphinx? It said one is built much farther back.
No, they didn't establish a relationship because the Sphinx, being a Sphinx, is even more mysterious to people as to what it even represents. So they just sort of passed by it lightly in our book. Okay.
Gentleman has a question.
Jerry had any personal experience in
Not really. I was with a group. We did crawl into one of the pyramids. Maybe it's the one you're talking about, the big one. Yeah. It sounds like there's a passage in there and that may have been the one that we crawled through. But when you're crawling through it, you got a bunch of people, it's not the same thing as going in by yourself and sitting in a chamber, and that would be really wonderful.
I see.
Yeah. You have to go with the right group.
Yes.
We also had a group of people in the room that came into, the inner sanctum, you might say, was only about the size of the foyer, and there were maybe 20 people in our group or so. But still, they got everybody to be quiet.
Turn the lights out.
And they actually turned the lights out, and then they simulated the light of the sun, I forget, coming through that shaft and hitting it, as if it was the December 21st
It's pretty cool.
solstice. And so people were quiet, and it was ooh, it was
I
like-
would love to have meditated there.
Yeah. We both
Okay.
really felt it.
So,
Okay, now we continue descending into Dwapara, and they come into other aspects of it historically and culturally and scientifically. So comparing the ascending and the descending Dwapara, of course, just to restate the obvious, we are currently in ascending Dwapara. We're actually in the Sandhi. No, actually we exited the Sandhi, didn't we?
yeah.
Yeah, so we're in Dwapara proper. So, let's see. So they discuss for some time in this chapter how it is that in our ascending Dwapara, we are in this bustling technology, just, being discovered, just so much, just revolutionary kind of technology that keeps increasing. And there would be an assumption that maybe in the descending, since it was also Dwapara, it would have been similar. But they went at great lengths to try to explain why it was probably not similar. That what we are doing is we're coming out of Kali Yuga, we're coming out of a material age and going towards the age of Treta and great mental and telepathic powers. And so we're discovering the secrets of the atom and energy and all of that on our way in that direction, but we're coming out of the material reality. That's one aspect, whereas the descending Dwapara was coming out of an age where they had that mental power and that attunement and the telepathic powers and the inner powers. And from there, from before it, even the spiritual powers. So they were coming from that age down towards the material age, but they they were still hearkening back to what they had. So they had the understanding of energy. They were coming in with that into that age, whereas we have lost it for a long, long time and went through the darkness of Kali Yuga and are now coming out and towards the understanding of energy again. So they describe that as at least part of the reason why we don't find proof of the exact same kinds of technology like we have discovered nowadays. But the other aspect they touch on is the fact that because they were coming out of Satya and then Treta, where, as you remember, populations become smaller and smaller in those higher ages, the speculation is that in the descending Dwapara, the population was probably only about 25 million people on the entire planet, whereas today we have 7 plus billion people, more than 250 times more of a global population. So because of our giant global population, we have all kinds of needs of discovering the technologies that we need in order to feed and support and sustain our large populations, whereas way back in descending Dwapara, with only 25 million people on the entire planet, they lived happily ever after in all the fields and bounty of the earth at that time. So they describe that as the difference between the two. In one, I think I get into this in a future slide, so let's move on. Was that me? No. Okay.
Somebody dropped their crystal ball.
Okay. So in the descending Dwapara, with the Great Pyramids cited as an example, they had very complex mathematics and the complexity of the subtle energies, as Riemann described, fixed into the pyramids, and yet they were made out of stone, out of a very simple material. You see, even though they were technologically super advanced, they were made out of simple materials. They cite all kinds of proofs, like the misidentified crystal objects in the British Museum, which they've only recently discovered as really being magnifying glass. And in the Cairo Museum, the bowls from the Great Pyramid are actually speculated now to be resonators. They weren't just eating bowls, they actually were resonators of... I think it's meant to measure seismic and things like that, but it could also be sound. Yeah, they didn't extrapolate on that. They found necklaces with copper alloy, sort of thin copper-like threads in them with extremely fine wire that had to have been created by very refined instruments. They could not have been created by the sort of Stone Age instruments that we see in typical history books. So, in descending Dwapara, then they were working with life force. They were working from the inside out, whereas in ascending Dwapara, we're working from the material realms, the outside in, and going towards the understanding now of atoms and things like that. But we're moving to the inside, whereas in coming down from Treta in descending, we were already from the inside, and we were beginning to have to relate to the outside world as we lost our mental powers. Let's see, existing Dwapara. Yeah, So what they speculate is that in descending Dwapara, magic, different from magic as we tend to think of it, and they describe why, and I'll describe it too, but the highest forms of magic, meaning attunement to the inner life force and the ability to manipulate life force, to work with life force, was how the descending Dwapara people, at least at the initial descent from Treta down into descending Dwapara, were behaving and relating to the world. Let's go on. So what happened is that the more we descended in descending Dwapara, the closer we descended down towards Kali, the more self-interest came into being. And so the magic that was used, the working with life force and energies that was used in the higher age, as we became more and more self-interest, turned into power. And the more that self-interest, sort of magnetized and fed on itself, it turned into black magic. It was used to gain power and to have power over others. But that wasn't originally how it started in its pure forms. And so you would see in the descending Dwapara, in the initial years of it, in the initial centuries of it, you would see priests blessing fields for crops. You would see healing that took place energetically and with the use of life force. It only became sort of evil when self-interest ended in as we descended towards Kali Yuga. Next. What they had as the instruments of the magic, they used the staff and the rod, like the wands in magic. Those were really used to transmit power. Charms transmitted power, symbols, fire, water, air, earth. Mantras were used. And as those mantras became more and more infused with self-interest in the greater descent of Dwapara, it turned into magic spells and inappropriate use and self-use or self-interest use. Let's go on. There's a lot of proof that they describe for the healing methods in descending Dwapara. Tons and tons of profound healing that took place in the West, in the out of Treta. So I'm talking about the 3100 or so BC time frame when descending Dwapara was first started. In the Edwin Smith papyrus in the West, which were these volumes of written materials, they had descriptions of surgeries, of trauma treatments, of suturing, and they listed, about 10 or 12 other major medical kinds of procedures. Preventing and curing infection with honey and moldy bread. I mean, they were already using penicillin, but they didn't know it. That's way back then. Organs were described with great detail, so they had complete understanding of the human anatomy. Spells, potions, charms, and prayers were all used for healing on the higher levels of these things in that range of time. In the East, in India, Ayurveda came into being in that time frame. It's the Atharva Veda. How do you pronounce that, Sandhya? Atharva, yeah. Veda. That's the Veda that Ayurveda comes from, and it was born in that time frame. It describes 1,120 illnesses, 700 medicinal plants, 64 mineral preparations, 57 preparations from animal sources. a very powerful healing system. Just like Edwin Smith Papyrus, it included mantras, meditations, prayers, rituals, etc. for healing. In the East, also in China, acupuncture came into being in that time frame. The Chinese traditional medicine, CTM, Qigong, all came into being in exactly that same time frame. And then also in Iran, the Zoroaster, similar to the Vedas, included all concepts of healing, including right action and dharma, just like Krishna. So a lot of similarities in all these different sides of the world in descending Dwapara, all using healing modalities that we today consider alternative, but that used to be the centerpiece of healing. Next. Practical uses of magic. They had that illustration in the book of the Egyptian boatman protecting his cattle that you see over there from the crocodile at the bottom of the river by putting spells, by saying mantras, essentially, going across the river to protect the animals from the crocodile, and the crocodile just lay quietly at the bottom, didn't move. But the implication is, or the supposition is, that this magic meaning the use of the life force and of the inner magnetisms and energies to move the large stones, the 50-ton stones from Stonehenge and so on, so that it wouldn't be at least it's one way to look at it, rather than 2 million slaves carrying a 50-ton stone with ropes and wood and all these things that didn't even exist in that area, that they still had the use from Treta Yuga of the mental powers, and that they were able to move form and change form. 80-ton stones at the King's Chamber, 90 tons at Easter Island, 300 to 400 tons at the Baalbek Triathlon. Just incredible to think of how, today, what it would take to move anything like that, just with our material realities. Let's go to the next one. This is a picture of that giant one. The conclusion of chapter 17 was then that the inherent mutability of matter was exploited intuitively and magically in descending Dwapara, rather than scientifically and technologically in ascending Dwapara. So subtle but very fascinating differences, I think. Any thoughts or questions? I know I have some. John? Where's Biasa when we need him?
I had a question I was going to ask him last week, but I was afraid to ask it.
Well, before you say it, let me say that, no, I want to say something to everybody. When Biasa was leaving, he said, please tell everyone that I'm very interested in receiving more questions from people. If they want to email him, and we can give you his email address. He said, questions help stimulate my thinking and send me in directions of more research that I might not think of on my own. So he really appreciates it. John?
Okay, I remember a long time ago having a dream that I was reading, or whatever phrase you want to use, things I'd never seen before, very much advanced. And the next day, morning, I tried to write down what I remembered. And I bring this up because what I remembered was great calamities of a very advanced civilization. And it likely would have happened in descending Dwapara, way up near the top, where the misuse of some of the powers that had been known prior to that. People came along after, misused them, and may have caused atomic explosions, the city of Atlantis. I think we talked about this briefly, but where would we place calamities like that? Would that be in the top of descending Dwapara or some other area?
Well, that's a good question. I know Yogananda warns us of great calamities coming because exploitation of the atomic scene is going to cause a lot of that and already has caused some of that. But where would it be on the other side, coming down, you think, at the beginning, where they had more knowledge of it?
Well, they'd have more knowledge of it in descending at the end of Treta and so forth, but they'd also have had less incentive.
The wars didn't
coming
really
out of
come in
that.
until much later.
But yeah, well, the book talks about in a different chapter, not in the chapters we're covering tonight, and 2 weeks ago when we talked about Treta, they talked about certain weapons of mass destruction for which there are curious records of, I forget the term, when everything's turned to glass, similar to the heat and fusion of a nuclear weapon. There's a couple of places on Earth where that occurs. The Mahabharata, however, which was much later in descending, in fact, at the end of descending, speaks of weapons in the Mahabharata that would seem analogous to weapons of mass destruction, but that would have been at the very end. Hard to say, but our authors speculate that war did exist to some degree, even in Treta, both ascending and descending, because people had great power then. And so even if they didn't form nations as they did in Dwapara or cities as much, there would have been use of these great powers once in a while. So.
Yes.
To ask all the, is Sri Yukteswar honoring St. Patty?
Oh, yes. Sri Yukteswar asked to borrow my hat. We're celebrating St. Patty's Day all week. So.
He didn't tell me. Yeah, he does look cute with that hat on. I don't know that
Anybody
he...
who could ride a sidecar through Calcutta can wear a cap.
Yeah.
Just beginning the ascent, and so as we go up and descending goes down, does it become more similar, or?
Well, actually, we're going to talk about that in one of the next chapters. A lot, yeah. So, chapter 18.
If we're in the first century of Dwapara proper ascending, our corollary would be the last century of descending Dwapara, which would be the ninth, I guess you call it the 9th century BC.
Yeah, and I have a whole chart that goes through that in
Right.
my other chapter.
So, it's interesting. Our authors made, I thought, an interesting point. They say, what's magic? Magic is any technology you can't explain. And this really fits. I mean, coming from the mental age, as they were losing that, they retained the trace memory, and of course the depths of the age, as in any age, would have the actual power and be able to transmit that to other initiates. But in any case, they would have the sort of collective conscious memory of such superior powers that would be embedded in their DNA, if you will. And therefore, they're resorting to these, and as the Vedas attempted, as we saw 2 weeks ago, to capture the power of the mental age through these mantras, to mind a tool, remember? Mantra, mind tool. And so naturally, in the descending Dwapara here, they would have been resorting, perhaps somewhat desperately, to the use of these mind tools, and would appear to do what we call magic because we don't understand it. they would have understood it, but only maybe fewer and fewer people could actually do it. In the Bible, they remind us of the story where Moses came to the Pharaoh, and Moses turned his staff into a snake, remember? And then the other dudes turned theirs into snakes, but Moses' snake ate their snake. And the point was, there was no issue whether they could turn them into snakes. It was that his mojo was more powerful than theirs. And that was his point, that his God was more powerful than theirs.
The other
And so-
thing Swami often talks about is, if you came in the 1700s and you showed people a television, they'd think it was witchcraft. They think it was magic, It was,
Cell phone,
Yeah.
smartphone, gee. So, okay. So now we're going to talk about some general trends that are of interest. Again, we're talking of, in the proper sense, 2900 BC to 900 BC. And we'll start with, so what we have is kind of a curvature. Think of it this way, descending Dwapara and coming into Dwapara, but losing ground quickly, because after all, the two smaller ages are much more compressed in terms of number of centuries, aren't they? So losing ground quickly is the mental power and the mental virtue of Treta, okay? Rising in the other direction, however, is selfishness or self-interest, meaning the lack of mental virtue. So the power is declining, whereas the self-interest is ascending, if you will, or increasing. And so the use of some of the mental powers and so forth are, as it were, being desperately used and increasingly used even as their grip on them is decreasing for self-interest. So this is a theme that we saw in analyzing our age many weeks ago, which is our age, especially in its early stages, very much motivated by self-interest. In thinking about this chapter and tonight, I reflected on how our Constitution or the Bill of Rights, or what's the other thing they wrote, the first thing they wrote? Declaration of Independence, right. It was right out of Adam Smith, Pursuit of Happiness. Self-interest. Adam Smith laid the foundation for Dwapara Yuga in saying that self-interest, he didn't mince a word. Now, he was a high-minded person, as according to my studies of the person as an individual, but nonetheless, we don't question that self-interest. Capitalism is sort of based on the myth that self-interest is self-serving to all. That's a joke, but it is if our self-interest is enlightened. But that's, of course, not a given, especially in our age. And so one of the trends they're talking about is in the descending Dwapara, as opposed to our age was ascending, is the rise of self-interest. And though they don't use the term, it's implied in the term self-interest, the rise of individuality, a.k.a. ego. Okay. At the same time, even though there is evidence of ancient cities in descending Treta, in the mental age, cities began to form towards the very end of Treta. They don't take on the vibrancy of what we would recognize as a commercial hub, self-interest, commerce. The business of America is business. Dwapara Yuga is about money, possessions, self-aggrandizement, position, title, and so forth. And so the rise of cities as vibrant commercial hubs, primarily commercial, began then in the early stages of descending Dwapara. Okay, they make a very interesting point. I can sort of, because I know these two authors fairly well as anybody, I can feel Purushotama's thinking in some of these things and can hear him smile behind it. But he says, whereas conventional theory says that these Stone Age people finally figured out how to grow things and domesticate animals and so on and so forth, because cities did exist in the prior age, they say, well, is it because they were able to or they wanted to? With the rise of self-interest. Imagine, okay, we see it today, don't we? All, take India. Country I'm very familiar with, at least relative to most people. Millions of people are leaving their beautiful villages, communing with nature. Well, and of course, being tongue-in-cheek here, of course, it's practically serfdom. But anyway, all going to the cities. Same in China. Millions of people, even today, are moving to the cities. Why? They want to get ahead. I mean, I'm not knocking it at all. But nonetheless, as you stimulate your own sort of individuality and getting ahead above somebody else and so forth, cities offer much more variety in that way. Okay, division of labor, diversity of skills, trade, commerce, taxation, and government. And this brings us to a list of some of the cities that they gave us. The oldest ones, according to conventional history, is Sumeria, right at the very bottom edge of Treta, the mental age, coming into Dwapara Yuga. And they give the cities there, Sumeria being, in my mind, somewhere in south of Turkey, Syria, and so forth. Also in the Indus Valley, a little bit later, the famous cities of Harappa, Mohenjo, with their very sophisticated construction methods and so forth. Egypt began building of cities, 3100, right on the cusp of the switch between the ages. The Minoan civilization about that time. Troy, similarly. China, they give a wider range into Dwapara 4, and Peru, same thing. So it's quite interesting how the dates are very, very similar. They talk about living quarters being over shops, and this is the trend now in the Roosevelt District and cities all across America, what they call, I think it's multi-use or something anyway, where you put the apartments on top of the shops. We saw that decades ago in cities. Now it's coming back. They talk about thousands and thousands of these clay seals with personal logos like your own stamp that were used for commerce to identify the goods and so forth. The first known writing, as far as we are aware of in conventional history, is in Sumeria. And was it to write my thoughts? No. It was for accounting. It was for goods and trade and commerce. Only later came general writing and composition and so forth as we know it. The letters for writing were taken from these symbols, had their origins in the symbols used on these seals. Okay, did you just change it? This is a new, yeah, I guess it is, okay. They found things like warehouse receipts, lists of goods being shipped between the different cities. The trade to the Near and Far East was quite extensive, and the scribes of their time were essentially accountants. Let's see. The largest city was Babylon, 1,700 years. But as self-interest grew and as power declined, mental virtue declined, war finally eclipsed commerce. And so it was that as the Kali Yuga darkened the world, the Silk Route all but disappeared. Later in Kali Yuga, Roman trade, though it had some trade with the west coast of India, not much. It was largely limited to their own empire. Spices, which were once plentiful, disappeared. Only in ascending Kali during the age of exploration and so forth did it gradually reappear. Another trend, as they call it, has to do with the quality of life. And far from what conventional historians, or whatever you call those people who make things up, are, in fact, during descending Dwapara, in the different civilizations, law courts and individual rights were rather prevalent, the rule of law. There were ownership records of land. There were cosmetics that were developed, hairstyles and salons. Beauty was very much appreciated, and we see that in statues and things. There are depictions of board games and toys for children. As Padma mentioned, physicians and sophisticated surgical techniques and medicines were common. Food was plentiful. And they make sort of a wry comment. They said there was indentured servitude, but they wondered if it wasn't much like working for corporations nowadays. They said it, not me. Okay. In respect to languages, the famous story of the Tower of Babel, which who knows if it's a real thing or not, it doesn't really much matter, but the placement of it by modern history, interestingly enough, places it right on the cusp of the end of the mental age and at the beginning of Dwapara. And it's at that same time that languages seem to appear out of nowhere. Linguistic experts trace most of the world's languages, the greatest number of them at least, to a small group of proto